Welcome to the Eat Away Kidney Stones podcast. I'm your host, registered dietitian and kidney stone expert, Melanie Betts. After learning a ton about kidney stones and helping people prevent stones at the University of Chicago, I was fed up with all the terrible advice people were finding online. So I decided to do something about it. The Kidney Dietitian was born. This podcast is for people who want to learn what actually works to prevent kidney stones and still enjoy life, eating, and their favorite foods. Let's dive in. Welcome to the 91st episode of the Eat Away Kidney Stones podcast. As always, I'm your host, registered dietitian and kidney stone expert, Melanie Betts. And today I'm diving into a very important question. I've definitely covered this topic before on the podcast in different ways, but it's such an important topic. I feel like it probably should be covered periodically on the podcast to make sure that everyone gets the answer. So the topic is, what if I can't drink milk? How do I get calcium? This is a question that I get asked probably literally daily from different, people on social media or my newsletter subscribers, et cetera, et cetera. So I think before we dive into the question of what if I can't drink milk, I think it's important to make sure everyone understands why we talk about milk/calcium so much here at the Kidney Dietitian and in kidney stone nutrition in general. So despite what makes intuitive sense, it's actually critical for people who form calcium-based kidney stones to get in enough calcium. If your doctor is telling you to limit calcium simply because you have calcium-based kidney stones, I would run far away from any nutrition advice they give you. This has been well known for decades now at this point and is very standard of practice because we know from a wide variety of studies that people who consume enough calcium consistently have fewer kidney stones. And in fact, there was actually a randomized controlled trial where they took a whole bunch of people who formed calcium oxalate kidney stones and basically told one group to follow a low calcium diet, which was sort of standard of practice at that point, decades ago, or told the other group to make sure that they consumed enough calcium. I'm not talking about a high calcium diet necessarily. We're generally just talking about a normal calcium diet, if you will. So just simply consuming the RDA, or the recommended dietary allowance, of general healthy amounts of calcium intake, which is around 1,000 to 1,200 milligrams of calcium per day, depending on your age and if you're a man or a woman, essentially. So this is not high calcium. Again, it's just consuming enough calcium. Anyway, so this randomized control study, and I'll link to it in the show notes, that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2002, I believe, by Borghi et al., found that those people who consumed enough calcium had a 49% lower risk of forming stones over about a 5-year time period compared to the people on that low calcium diet, from the only difference of getting in enough calcium. Like, just that one change reduced calcium oxalate stone risk by 50%, essentially, which is huge, and really just highlights that. And there's been many, many more studies that have found, again, that people who consume dairy or people who consume enough calcium generally have many fewer kidney stones compared to people who do not. So how in the world can that make sense, right? Like, you have calcium kidney stones. Why in the world should I be making sure that I get in enough calcium? There's sort of two angles that I always like to talk about this from. And the first angle is kidney stones, and the second angle is bone health. So let's dive into that kidney stone piece first. So most people are forming calcium oxalate kidney stones, right? Calcium oxalate kidney stones make up around 75-ish% of kidney stones that we have in the United States and the world. And calcium and oxalate love to bind. That's why they form kidney stones all the time, right? And we can use that love of binding to our advantage if we consume a diet that has enough calcium in it, along with a diet that hopefully has plenty of oxalate in it, because that means simply that you're eating a lot of healthy foods, right? You know that I'm not an advocate of a low oxalate diet, but I am an advocate of making sure that we reduce the bioavailability, or how much of that oxalate gets absorbed. So if you consume a diet that has enough calcium in it, you are going to be absorbing significantly less of the oxalate that happens to be in the healthy foods that you're eating. In fact, even if you have high urine oxalate levels in the first place, in my experience, just simply getting in enough calcium with meals ideally, 9 times out of 10, urine oxalate comes tumbling down, and we don't need to stress about those higher oxalate foods. But we really want to make sure that we're getting in enough calcium from our diet, because again, that will significantly reduce how much oxalate gets absorbed into our system. Instead, when we're eating enough calcium, most of the oxalate that we're eating actually gets excreted in our poop, right? It doesn't get absorbed into our system, where eventually it gets excreted in our urine, which we don't want, because that's where it can form kidney stones. Instead, that oxalate is simply going to be excreted in our feces, and we really don't need to worry about it. So again, by that sort of mechanism, that is why we care so much about people who form calcium oxalate stones specifically, or people who have high urine oxalate, no matter what kind of stone that you formed in the past. Why we care so much that you do get in enough calcium with in your diet. So I mentioned that the other sort of facet of this is bone health. So, and this is critical, because people who form calcium stones of any type, so this is calcium oxalate or calcium phosphate stones, are at much higher risk of bone disease, unfortunately. Those two things just go hand in hand. Yeah, that's just unfortunately the case, right? If you form calcium-based stones, you're at higher risk of things like fractures and osteoporosis and osteopenia and sort of these bone diseases, if you will. And so we certainly do not want you on a low calcium diet, since you are at risk of having bone disease. That is a terrible idea. And so even if you don't have high urine oxalate, if you are a calcium stone former of any type, I think it definitely makes sense to make sure that we're getting in enough calcium to protect your bones, because that bone health is very important, especially for us women, but for men as well, and especially if you're a man who forms calcium-based stones. So how much calcium is enough? So I mentioned earlier that the recommendation is around 1,000 to 1,200 milligrams per day. Technically, that breaks down differently if you're a male or a female, or your age, but honestly, this is splitting hairs. Like, our goal is around 1,000 to 1,200 milligrams of calcium per day. Again, this is not a high calcium diet. This is not a low calcium diet. This is just literally what all of us should be doing anyway. It's just like the general recommended amount of calcium that we should be getting. So, however, we talk about eating more calcium because on average, people in the United States at least are not consuming enough calcium. So for most of us, this means that we need to be eating more calcium. However, individually, you could be eating more than you need, or way less, right? So that I always like to kind of give that caveat. I'm not saying that everyone listening here needs to be eating more calcium, because I have no idea what you are eating, but most of us are not eating enough calcium. So for most of us, we should be getting in more. So how does that 1,000 to 1,200-ish milligrams of calcium translate to actual food? So for most people, whenever possible, I do recommend dairy, just simply because I think it's the easiest and best way that I can guarantee that you can guarantee that you're getting in enough calcium. Dairy has a lot of calcium in it, and it's also highly bioavailable, meaning that your body is really good at absorbing the calcium from dairy, primarily because there's not a lot of other stuff in there to kind of hinder how much it gets absorbed. Ironically, one of those things is actually oxalate. So if you consume dairy, I typically recommend around 2 to 3 servings of dairy per day with your meals, because again, hopefully you are eating a wide variety of fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts, seeds, and other plant proteins, because we know people who eat those types of foods tend to have fewer kidney stones and also tend to be healthier in general. And so if you are having a serving of dairy with your meals, you are going to be reducing the absorption of the oxalate from all of those healthy foods, and you're also going to be giving your bones the calcium that it needs. One serving of dairy is around a cup or so, 8 ounces of milk. It's going to be around 1 ounce of cheese, which is a kind of like 1 slice or like 4 dice of cheese, if you want to think about it that way, or around 3/4 a cup of yogurt. All of those servings are going to have somewhere around 250-ish milligrams of calcium per day. That definitely varies based on, variety and brand and those types of things, but nutrition really is kind of an estimate. It's really not an exact science. That's why I hate to throw out numbers, but I do understand that they're helpful. So one serving of dairy is going to give you that 250-ish milligrams of calcium. And when you consider that there's a little bit of calcium in nearly everything that you eat, right? There's going to be a little bit of calcium in most vegetables. There's going to be some in whole grains, right? There's little bits in even fish, right? There's little bits in kind of everything. All of that kind of adds up to get us to that 1,000 to 1,200 milligrams of calcium per day. So if you are, again, consuming especially 3 servings of dairy per day, but I say 2 to 3 just because, it kind of makes it easier. And I don't think everyone necessarily needs to be getting in those 3, but those 2 to 3 servings of dairy per day, I can pretty much guarantee that if you are also eating a healthy, varied diet, that you're getting to that 1,000 to 1,200 milligrams of calcium per day. I want to take a quick hiatus here and go a little bit on a tangent to debunk a common myth that I see in low oxalate wellness influencers online. And that myth is that we should be avoiding how much oxalate we eat and avoiding healthy fruits and vegetables and nuts and seeds and whole grains because of oxalate, because that oxalate is going to reduce how much, it's going to basically put our bones at risk, and it's going to make it so our body's not absorbing calcium. And I just wanted to say flat out that is completely not true, because when you look at how much calcium our bodies absorb from our food in general, it's a very small percentage, right? Like our bodies only absorb like 20-ish% of the calcium from our food anyway, and that varies widely because our bodies are actually really, really, really good at absorbing how much calcium our bodies need. So there's literally systems in place that upregulate how much calcium our bodies absorb if our bodies need more calcium, and they downregulate how much calcium our bodies absorb if we don't need so much calcium. So our bodies are super, super smart, and they're gonna take how much calcium our bodies need from our foods. I wanted to throw out that. The other thing is that, these wellness influencers often say like, oh, we're not going to be getting calcium, so it's going to be bad for our bones to be eating this high oxalate diet that has lots of fruits and vegetables in it. And that also is insane, because when we look at people who have good bone health, they tend to eat a lot of those higher oxalate foods, right? Just like pretty much every healthcare condition or every disease in the world, people who consume more plant-based foods, who consume more fruits and vegetables and plant proteins, especially compared to sort of the average consumption of these foods in the United States, they tend to have better health outcomes. They tend to have healthier bones. They tend to have lower rates of kidney stones, for example, and heart disease and cancer and high blood pressure and kidney disease and diabetes and like all of these sort of chronic health conditions. So just wanted to very quickly debunk that, because I hear that question a lot, like, oh, is it okay to consume these oxalate foods when, people are telling me that means I'm not going to be absorbing the calcium from the food? That is completely incorrect, because again, your body is super smart. It's not absorbing no one is absorbing 100% of the calcium from the food anyway. We're only absorbing around 20-ish%. And again, our body's going to absorb more if our bodies need more calcium, and going to absorb less if our bodies need less calcium. So back to the question at hand, of the topic of the podcast episode today, which is, what if I don't eat dairy? Again, I do recommend dairy first whenever possible, but I completely understand that not everyone can tolerate dairy, and also that people might avoid dairy for ethical or religious reasons, and obviously that is completely okay, and I 100% respect that choice. And if that is the case, my next best recommendation is using plant-based milk substitutes, just because I know that these things have calcium in them, and that calcium is just so important. I really want to make sure that we are getting in that calcium to A, reduce how much oxalate gets absorbed into your system, and B, making sure that we are giving your body the calcium that it needs to protect your bones. And so again, if you don't consume dairy, my next recommendation is using those plant-based substitutes. So using things like oat milk or coconut milk or pea protein milk, or even almond milk or soy milk. All of these can be really great options. I know that throwing out the almond and soy milk is going to be a little bit scary, because I know those are scary foods that are higher in oxalate. However, when you look at how much oxalate is actually in those drinks per cup, it's not really that much. I think that a cup of almond milk only has like 30-ish milligrams of oxalate per cup, which really is not that much at the end of the day. And again, there is no data that shows that eating a super strict strict low oxalate diet is going to prevent stones anyway. And so if you really love that almond milk, I would not fear it just simply because it has those 30-ish milligrams of oxalate in it. I would definitely just go ahead and use it because you're getting in the calcium, right? Like that almond milk is so high in calcium. I mean, obviously this varies quite different, there's a huge variation by brand, but 1 cup of almond milk typically has like 350 to 400-ish milligrams of calcium per day. So per cup. And so there is more than enough calcium in that almond milk to essentially stop, I can't say for sure, but like there's going to be very, very little of that oxalate that gets absorbed anyway because of all that calcium. So I wouldn't worry about it. Especially since I know that, all of these plant-based milk substitutes taste very different, certainly very differently than like normal cow's milk, and taste very different than each other. And sometimes it can be tough to find one that is sort of palatable to you, that you really enjoy. And if you really like that almond milk, then please, like by all means, go ahead and use it. The only caveat is if you do have really stubborn high urine oxalate, which again, does not happen very often. And in my experience, the vast majority of the time we can get urine oxalate levels down with consuming enough calcium, period. Generally, people don't even have high urine oxalate levels to begin with. But if you do have super stubborn high urine oxalate levels, then maybe we don't want to use the almond milk, just to kind of see if one of the other things does make a difference. But in my experience, I've practically never seen this. So using bottom line is using whatever plant-based substitute milk you like works for you. My personal favorite is coconut, but I know that can also be sort of controversial because I feel like coconut is one of those flavors that you either love or hate from my understanding. But but if you like coconut milk is delicious and can be a really great substitute for different things. So that is definitely my next recommendation. Again, is using those plant-based milk substitutes because I really, really want to make sure that you are getting in that calcium again, because it is so, so crucial, both from a kidney stone prevention standpoint as well as a bone health standpoint. A question that I commonly get about these plant-based substitutes is that they are obviously fortified with calcium. None of these things is going to naturally be that high in calcium. So when you buy almond milk, say, or soy milk, or coconut milk, or whatever it is, it's pretty much guaranteed to be fortified with calcium. And now I always say that we don't want to take calcium supplements. So people are like, Melanie, what in the world is the difference? And honestly, there's not any data to show that, calcium supplements in a pill are different than calcium supplements in an almond milk, say fortified almond milk, or orange juice for that matter, or is different than like milk that's naturally high in calcium. But I can say in my experience that I don't typically see urine calcium levels spike from plant-based milk substitutes. The concern with calcium supplements versus sort of naturally occurring calcium is that natural occurring calcium tends to not raise urine calcium levels as much. It will a little bit, but nothing compared to what we will see with people taking calcium supplements. There's really no data to show different calcium urine rises in, again, that pill form versus fortified versus natural form. But in my experience, and also sort of expert opinion, if you will, those fortified milk substitutes seem to not raise that urine calcium as much. And again, that calcium is so, so stinking important for you as a calcium stone former. I want to make absolutely sure that we are getting in that calcium. So the last thing I wanted to mention is sort of some different vegetables that do have a fair amount of calcium in them. And I do think that these can be used to give you some calcium. I would, and this is really my personal take again, because I know that calcium is so important. It makes me really, really nervous to sort of depend on some of these vegetables that I'm about to mention 100% for your calcium intake. So I would love, again, dairy sort of being my number one recommendation, followed by these plant-based substitutes. But I do think, especially if you're, say, getting in 2 servings of dairy or, dairy alternative, maybe your 3rd serving of calcium-rich foods could be one of these vegetables that really does have a fair amount of calcium in it. So when I say these high higher calcium vegetables, pretty much every single green leafy vegetable. So spinach, which I know is super controversial. I'm not saying go eat a ton of spinach, but I do think sometimes having it is not going to be the end of the world. But also other much lower oxalate greens like collard greens or mustard greens. 1 cup of cooked greens like this has around 250 milligrams of calcium, which is essentially the same as a cup of milk. So that really can be used to just kind of help mix it up and to vary your calcium sources, which is kind of always a good option. The other food that's often discussed when we think about non-dairy sources of calcium is actually like canned fish. So salmon, not salmon like a fillet that we might typically consume, but salmon that is canned with bones, because bones obviously have calcium in them. If it's canned with the bones, 3 ounces of that has around 200-ish milligrams of calcium, which is not bad. So that could potentially be another source. Plus salmon, of course, has all those really heart-healthy fatty acids that might actually be beneficial for kidney stones. There's a little bit of data to suggest that that may be the case as well. So that could be another way to get in that calcium. Another food that I personally cannot do, but I know that some people do love, is canned sardines. If they're canned with the bones, you have to make sure of that, because if the bones aren't there, there's not going to be a ton of calcium in it. But 3 ounces of sardines canned with bones is going to give you around 320 milligrams of calcium, which is quite a bit. That's actually more than a cup of milk. So those foods, if you enjoy them, can be a way to sort of boost your calcium intake. And again, just kind of diversify those calcium sources, because, dairy really is, I'm going to put it sort of as the gold standard of calcium for people with kidney stones. Again, just because we know that it's there, we know that it gets absorbed, and we know consistently that people who consume dairy do have less stones. However, you do not need to consume dairy. There's lots of other ways to get it. But even if you do consume dairy, just kind of using these other things to mix it up once in a while, I think can be totally fine. And diversity really is the spice of life, and diversity really is really important when we think of nutrition, because different foods give us different nutrient profiles and benefits and phytochemicals and all sorts of different things. And so variety, the more variety the better, is a really good rule of thumb when it comes to nutrition in general. So with that, I will end this episode of the podcast. I will link to a couple different blog articles that I have that I think will be really helpful on this topic if you want to read up on it more. And if you're interested in learning a little bit more about the connection between bone health and kidney stones, I would definitely recommend checking out a couple different episodes of the podcast that I've recorded already. I would definitely recommend checking out episode 58, where I talk about, it's called Bones and Stones, so sort of just generally what's the connection between kidney stones and calcium intake and bone health. And I would also go way back and go back to episode 17 of the podcast, where I interviewed a nephrologist that I worked with at the University of Chicago. Her name is Dr. Anna Zisman. She is amazing. And we talk about lots of different things, but we, in the through our discussion, talked a lot about the connection between bone health and kidney stones. So that's a really great listen in general, but also especially if you're interested in learning a little bit more about bone health and kidney stones. So again, as always, thank you so much for listening to the podcast, and I hope to see you again next Wednesday. Thank you for listening to today's episode. For more help with kidney stones, check out my website, www.thekidneydietitian.org. For more personalized help from me, check out my online course, Kidney Stone Nutrition School. VIP enrollment includes help directly from me. I can't wait to see you there and help you prevent kidney stones. Have a great day.